I mean, do you think? I don't know what you make of sort of current offerings from the industry, and I know you said you read my interview with Warren Spector, and he and I were talking about the lack of innovation in the
Hmm.
game industry. I don't know if you got to that part. I know these interviews,
Mm-hmm.
they're long read.
Yep.
I don't know if you got to that, but I mean, do you have any thoughts? Like, do you feel like, as these game design academia programs, like as they are more part of the landscape, like, do you feel like are they doing their part to sort of shake up the amount of innovation? Do you feel like is Warren just being overly pessimistic? Do you feel like there's a lot more creativity, or excuse me, more innovation than people give credit for? I mean, it's a series of questions, but I'm just
Sure. I
curious
mean,
what
when
your
I went to
thermometer is
school,
on it. Yeah.
when I went to school, certainly it was very focused on first-person shooter, and that was it. Um, but since then, I not that I've looked at curriculums, but looking at all the indie games that have popped up on Steam and elsewhere, you have all these different platforms to do indie games on now. I think it's really kind of hopeful. You're seeing a lot of variety of genres in the independent games. I mean, one I played that I liked a lot from a few years ago is Papers, Please,
Mm-hmm.
which is so bizarre. And I tried to describe that game to people at work, and they said, "Oh, that's really depressing," or "Oh, that sounds like work. Why would I play that?" And I think it's precisely because it's so boring and so weird. It reminds me of some of the stranger simulation games I played as a kid on the computer, like Sim Ant, or
Yeah.
what was another one? Eva was a weird Super Nintendo one where you evolved creatures. But yeah, I mean
That was one of my all-time favorite games growing up. I remember Evo.
Oh, do great,
Yeah,
yeah, and,
yeah,
and that
yeah.
if you knew what to do, you could make it a human at the
Yes,
end, or
that's true.
uh-huh. Oh, that was. I tried playing that recently, and it was much harder than I remembered.
Yes, it's
but,
very hard.
it's funny, but so yeah, I do think you see a lot of different genres out there, especially in the independent game space, and I think it's a bit hopeful. I'm not sure what they're teaching, but I hope
Yeah.
that whatever they're teaching, they're exposing students to a variety of game engines that are out there. Certainly, a lot of people make things like Unity, but I was surprised to see you even have such specific products that make you make only like one specific genre of game, like visual novels, or that you can get that granular even with the drag and drop game design programs. I think is pretty amazing. Or you see games like Hatoful Pigeon on the
Yeah.
PlayStation. Just kind of blows my mind.
I mean, did you sense even I don't know how old the campers were that you were teaching. For some reason I'm assuming junior high.
It was junior high mainly,
Yeah.
a few high school, but yeah.
Do you remember sort of just talking with them, like getting a sense of like the way that maybe they viewed video games or the game industry like differently than you did, just by virtue of them being younger, having not as much of a memory of or awareness of things, just by virtue of their age? I mean, do you remember just sort of noticing things that people said, or their perspective on stuff that's different than how you remember it, or not what you would have expected?
The main thing I noticed is I'm trying to think. It's been a while. I noticed that they work. They were mainly interested in new games and not in the old ones as much. You had a few that had like Super Nintendo emulators in their laptops, but what seemed to be really big, especially with group of kids, were stuff like Dance Dance Revolution.
Mm-hmm.
Was big, and Parappa the Rapper, even though that was sort of an older game at the time.
Yeah.
It was something they would pull up. So a lot of those. So you'd have a few people that would play like the side scrollers, like Mega Man 8 or something on the PlayStation 1.
Right.
I remember people playing one time, but it was just before World of Warcraft, so people weren't into that, but you had some people into Star Wars Galaxies.
Okay. Yeah.
And some of those games. So it was really, I don't know if it was an ignorance of history of old games, but it certainly wasn't something they talked a lot about.
Did they talk much about their view of the industry and how the industry works, or their thoughts about video game culture?
They did not. I do remember, come to think of it, we did have at the computer camp someone came in to speak from I think Atari Games. And they showed a highlight reel of, it was basically like, sometimes in a game you can unlock behind the scenes, like a 10-minute documentary.
Yeah.
They showed those for a Transformers PS2 game, I think Driver 3, and something else. And one kid's reaction to that I thought was so bizarre. I just have to share this story.
Please do.
Okay, so this kid was really into Pokemon, and even though this guy
I don't even know why I'm laughing.
Yeah, so
see, if that's the opening detail,
right.
This is going to be a good story.
Yeah, and clearly this guy was from Atari Games. He had nothing to do with Nintendo.
Of course.
And this guy, and I've seen adults do this at conventions, but he decides he's going to pitch a game idea to the guy that's there speaking, and he says, "I have an idea, if I may be so bold, where Zelda goes on an adventure and he picks up the Pokemon friends and they go around and do all this stuff." And this guy from Atari Games cut this kid off and said, "Listen, kid, I don't do anything with Nintendo." And you had this 12-year-old boy, you just see his dreams being crushed. I don't know what he expected to happen.
Well, I'm sure that left a very good impression on him.
Perhaps so.
Well, how was your day? I got yelled at by the king of video games, or however it is that. I guess it's just it's just a kid being a kid.
I think so. Also, you had a younger audience, and they were showing sort of games geared towards older people.
Yeah, Transformers would be a little. Yeah.
So I think the kids weren't that interested in it.
Well, I don't know. Zelda is about as old as that other stuff, but
Zelda's as old as that stuff. But I think I don't know at the time if a Transformers game in 2004 would have meant anything to.
Well, so I want to talk a little bit about some of your writing stuff and sort of how you came to realize that you prefer that over making games. But would you still want to work in the game industry? Is that a thing that still interests you?
Not really. I wouldn't mind coming out with another game myself.
Yeah.
I did a text adventure, Frankenstein's Bastard Daughter, a few years ago, and that took me 2 years because I chose a dumb platform to develop it on. But I think I could do something faster. It's more of a time issue, but not. I'm happy with what I'm doing now, and I like the writing. I think is especially rewarding in my spare time, and getting paid for some of that finally is nice. Because I really grew up a lot, not just playing games, but reading a lot of those magazines like Nintendo Power and PC Gamer, and that I was able to sell an article to PC Gamer just really meant a lot to me, because that was a magazine I would read every month, and I subscribed to that magazine long after my computer could run the computer games they were talking about. But I just still liked reading the writing and seeing the pictures, and the internet was around in the late 90s, but it's nowhere near what it is today. It was still
different
pretty
internet, yeah.
Very different, yeah.
Well, so I'm sure you've read about I'm not even sure how to categorize it, but I guess I'm curious, just contrasting the tech industry and the game industry. Obviously, if we're talking about you went and you got a degree in games and you couldn't get a foot in the door. My question is basically about nepotism. For people who don't really follow games or the tech industry, do you feel is there comparable amounts of nepotism from games as there is in tech? Does one have more? Or do you not really get a sense that there is much nepotism at all?
What do you mean by nepotism in relation to?
Just as far as just people who seem to get in the door, because I guess nepotism meaning just, people hiring relatives or people who are friends of relatives versus just, people trying to claw their way in from regardless of whoever it is that they know.
There's certainly a lot of friends of people I notice get hired in tech. I don't know about family members necessarily, but
Yeah.
and certainly the way how I got my start doing QA and tech support, which I've only been doing for about 3 years, is I started doing copy editing for this company, and then I saw they had an opening for in IT doing QA and tech support, and I just sort of leapt on it.
Gotcha.
Because I had the computer skills, and I wanted, and not that a lot of people could do that move, like jumping sideways into a position, but certainly at sort of, medium or big size companies, you might have that opportunity. Like even if you're just answering phones at the front desk, something could come up, and that you're a known entity within that company. It certainly never hurts you, as opposed to a random person applying blindly over the internet.
Yeah, which is unfortunately typically the way that dynamic works. So, I mean, I think one of the last questions I'll ask you about just academia and games is, I mean, I guess at a certain level, like someone can read, what we've said so far and sort of draw a conclusion that, maybe there's something, either wrong with the way, academia works. I mean, do you feel like outside of just those sort of general, statements about academia and sort of the ways that it doesn't necessarily guarantee people getting work in the field that they're studying, I mean, do you feel like, yeah, okay, it was the first year you were studying, but I mean, the first year that program existed, I mean, do you feel like, they misrepresented the program? Do you feel like they misrepresented the industry, getting work in the industry? Do you feel like there was some sort of like very, basic way that they didn't, hold up their end of the deal?
I would say yes, and I would almost expand that to most colleges as a whole. In that you, as I sort of said earlier, it's like at the end of the day you get a piece of paper, and you still have to do quite a lot of legwork to get jobs. And if I was to give, this isn't really what you're asking, but if I was to give any advice to someone going into college, it would be do as many internships during the summer as you can.
Well, I'm laughing just because, I studied the music business when Napster was happening, so I got a degree in an industry that was resisting change while it was starting, like when it thought that suing its own customers would be the best way forward. So I got, similar to you, I studied an entertainment industry, and I studied sort of the way that it works, but it was at a time when everybody was in shock and unsure about what the future was. I mean, some things like, even copyright law was changing because of just how much the internet was impacting things. And so that laugh, I was not laughing at you. It was just I can certainly relate. And I don't work in the music industry.
And what you mentioned actually reminded me of a story of what happened near the end of college, and it just shows you how fast technology changes. Yeah. Even in a few years. So in what limited 3D graphics courses, I took the bare minimum possible just because I was so bad at it. But they were very big on poly counts. Like if it was a main character, it had to have a poly count of below 10,000, I think, and all this stuff. And then right as we were graduating, Xbox announced the specs on the Xbox 360, and a bunch of new graphics cards came out to computers, and all those limits they had placed on us as absolute requirements that you need for these demos for your demo reel went out the window.
Yeah.
Because a whole new generation of graphical power and processors had come out on the market.
And further to your point, things move so quickly now that that's been the way that it's worked since, the 80s and 70s. And now we're seeing a half generation of consoles, and now, like just people are, skeptical whether, is the next generation of consoles just going to be a computer, and it's splitting off into VR and all these other things. So, I mean,
the half generation of consoles, I'll be very interested to see how they do. I was at a Target the other day, overhearing clerks talk about the PlayStation 4 Pro and the PS4 VR, and they got every single detail wrong.
Interesting.
And I wanted to correct them, but part of me is like, I had to let it go. I'm not a Target employee. I have no skin in the game.
What were they getting wrong?
They were saying like, so the PS4 Pro, it only works with certain games, and the VR, it comes with everything you need to do the VR games just in the box, which isn't necessarily the case.
Interesting.
And they had no idea what the price point of the different things was, just that they had to start displaying ad. It was more like the systems hadn't quite come out yet, but they're going to be displaying these ads in their flyers and these standees like, oh, pre-order your PlayStation 4 Pro at Target. and they know they're going to have customers bombard them with questions like, why should I buy this with that? And I've been following the news. I even know what's going on, and it's still very confusing. I showed from E3, there's that Mass Effect Andromeda video about showing it on the PS4 Pro to my wife, and I'm like, oh, it's supposed to work with the one we have now, but it won't look as good. But they're supposed to keep stuff working on the old ones, and she said, well, that's fine until something runs on the on the existing PS4 that looks like crap.
I mean, for me, it's like, just like the improvements are going to be so like not discernible to the human eye anyway. I mean, I get, why they're doing it, and this is sort of more granular and more nerdy than I usually get in these interviews, but I think it's pretty interesting. Like if you look at, I don't know if it was at Sony's dedicated event or if it was at E3, but I think it's interesting like how little they're playing up VR and all that stuff. I mean, yeah, there's a lot of advertising and stuff for it, but I think it's as such that like the PSVR stuff is not going to be like, basically this half generation is just a thing to make the VR thing be as good as it can be, and it sort of has negligible benefits otherwise. But anyway, just for the purpose of this recording, like the PSVR comes out like next week and everyone is still confused about it? Is this basically, not everyone, but yeah, I mean, we are people who care about it and are interested in it, and it's still confusing, right?
It is, and I wonder how it'll do. I mean, you have so many different VR platforms. You have the PS4 VR thing, you have the HTC Vive, you have the Oculus Rift. And I tried a demo of the HTC Vive at a Microsoft store, and I was not impressed how it had all these wires sticking out of your head. You were hooked to a computer.
Yeah.
And getting used to 3 dimensions all around you was interesting but gimmicky. And although the graphics were certainly better, I felt disappointed the same way I did when I tried a VR machine, I think called like Pterodactyl Madness from the late 90s. Where it's like all green, simple polygons, and you're shooting your friends or a pterodactyl that's flying around. It seems like something you would spend a few bucks for in an arcade, but I've been wrong about this stuff before.
It's okay.
I hope it doesn't fall on its face as much as like the 3D TV stuff did. Like that didn't seem to take off.
Yeah.
So.
So I mean, can you talk a little bit about? I mean, basically, I think this was the extent of the first note you sent to me, which was that 9 years after school, like you realized you prefer writing about games to making them.
Right. Yep.
So I mean, you mentioned earlier some of the places that you have written for, but can you tell me a little bit about just like how you realized that and sort of how you came to be comfortable with that being your, I guess, relationship with like the industry, I guess, is a way to put it, versus what you went to school for?
Sure. I mean, I think I sort of realized it. I was working on my text adventure game, and while that was fun, it was a lot of stress and a lot of time. And then afterwards, I did some writing for some websites, and it was a lot easier. But also, I've always enjoyed video game history. Even as a kid, I went to arcades and got to see what that was like, which isn't really around too much anymore, although you see it coming back with the bars that have the arcades in them.
Yeah.
And I especially like how game series change over time, and just I find the writing about that for an audience to be so satisfying. I'm putting my knowledge of games to a good use. It's I've always enjoyed writing. It's just satisfying, and frankly, it's more instant gratification than putting a few years into something for just one game. I could spend that time and write several articles or make some YouTube videos or something. It just was, the writing was more relaxing and less stressful, and in itself more of an enjoyable activity than the game design.
You said you used the word finally a couple moments ago about you're getting paid finally to write about games.
Yep.
Why finally? Did you spend a long time writing for other places and not really getting paid, or?
I did, yeah. Writing for websites where they would have a caveat where like, oh, we're not paying writers now, but we will eventually. Yeah. And you just get in the habit of writing for them, but finding places that pay or getting your foot in the door with some pitches, it's something that I've been doing more. But it's you really have to sort of look for it. It's not the easiest thing to find, and you're competing against a lot of other people. Especially since a lot like 1UP isn't around anymore. And I don't know, but the magazines aren't as much around anymore. A lot of those people write online, so you're competing with people that have written in the industry for years.
Yeah, I mean, do you think? I'm not asking you to tell me how much you're making off it. I mean, do you feel like if you had to, like, could you support yourself from writing?
Absolutely not. No. No.
Let the record show you.
Yeah.
I couldn't even finish that sentence.
I'm grateful for what I've been paid, and it's nice to get some money out of it. But yeah. I would write either way, would be the honest answer.
You would what?
Oh, I would write whether I'd get paid for it or not.
Oh, I see. Well, I mean, you had mentioned, and hopefully, I hope this doesn't come across in a transcript as, because it strikes me, you actually sound, fairly satisfied and happy, sort of about where things have wound up. Hopefully it doesn't sound like we're just dwelling on all the could have beens, but
sure.
You had also mentioned, that like, you should have moved to San Francisco sort of around the time after you finished college, which when you wrote me that, I remembered, because we graduated around the same time, I do remember there was like a huge sort of gold rush of people around that era, especially coming from, a couple people out from near me in Chicago, a couple people who now, they work their way up to a staff position at places like a 1UP. And they, now work at places like Sony or Oculus or wherever else. I mean, I'm sure the people who I'm talking about. I mean, when you say that, like you wish you had moved to San Francisco. I mean, were there people who, from afar, like people whose careers you had wanted to emulate, or was it more just you're curious to see what could have happened?
I think a little of both. In college, I did college radio and did some podcasting stuff fairly early on, and when I stumbled upon the 1UP podcasting stuff and saw that a lot of those people were out in San Francisco.
Some of them did move because it's too expensive.
Yeah, that's true, and some of them have moved back to other places.
Yeah.
I just found that very I would look from afar. In fact, it's sort of embarrassing, but I stopped listening to the 1UP stuff after a little while because it would make me I'd get too jealous.
Really?
Yeah. And it was strange. It's not like these are people I knew or anything, but it was I don't know, I guess envious and thinking what might have been, and at that time I was working doing data entry in a warehouse.
Yeah.
It was a difficult time for me personally with the work I was doing.
Yeah. I mean, did you feel, not that there's anything necessarily wrong with that job, did you just feel like you had sort of picked the wrong path and that you were stuck and you felt like
I felt sort of stuck, sort of like a dead end at the time, and things have gotten better since then, and I'm happier since then. But it was.
I mean, do you feel like obviously there's a lot of I don't know, a lot of the job of being a writer now, especially around that stuff, is like not only do you do the work of writing it, but you also, you engage with people on social media, and you participate in, it's an ongoing conversation that never ends. I mean, I think it's very similar, ironically, although I don't see it be compared all that often, people who write and people who make games. Do you feel like, I mean, is it harder for people who write or harder for people who make games to sort of cultivate a following and to become popular?
I think it would be harder for people that make games, just because there's so many games out there and so many games that don't get exposure. And if you're writing, you can write about a topic that's, it could be popular, it could have some sort of a fan base, and you'll have all sorts of people might contact you because of that. But you look at all the indie games on Steam, and Steam Greenlight, which is a whole separate topic.
Right.
And how do people even find something to download? It's like the selection on Netflix. It just blows my mind how you stand out in a crowd.
Do you think it's harder to support yourself as a writer or as a person who makes games?
I think it would be harder as a writer, because writer doesn't make. I mean, making games, you don't make that much either necessarily, but if you're working for a company, at least you're bringing in a regular paycheck. I'm thinking specifically of freelancing.
Yeah. What do you think it takes to get sort of popular as a writer or as a person who makes games?
I would say just being consistent in both updating, your Twitter, your Facebook, whatever social media you're using, but also with if you're a writer, it is coming out with articles consistently and finishing things is really important.
So you think it's I don't know, people talk about that a lot, where it's like, oh, video games are a meritocracy. You're saying that, people do appreciate just, hard work?
That's a big question.
Thank you.
I don't know if people that have never tried making a game realize how hard it is.
Yes.
I remember this is more about movies, but I took like an intro to film course in college, and making a short film was just really difficult. And since then, it was difficult for me to give a movie a really harsh review, because even just getting like anything done is a miracle in itself.
This is very true.
And when you're making a game, you're sort of you're not just pointing a camera at something, but you're doing graphics, you're doing sound, you're doing everything. Plus the thing has bugs in it, which isn't like the case with movies or even with writing. You might have typos or whatever, but you're in charge of everything. There's so many different moving pieces that have to work that finishing things is a victory in itself, even if nobody watches it, even if nobody plays it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the word often used is a miracle. It's a miracle anything gets made, and then it's like an even more miracle when it's like good.
Mm-hmm.
Well, so I have just one more question here for you,
Sure.
Unless is there something else you wanted to touch on that we didn't get a chance to talk about?
No, I don't think so.
Okay, well, I don't want you to feel like I'm rushing us along, and like I said, when I share the transcript, we can certainly, I'm sure I'll think of some extra questions, or you'll think of some stuff. You don't have to, but that's available to us. So
Sure.
So yeah, let me just ask you this. I mean, what do you think that video games have accomplished?
I think that video games have evolved to the point where they're a legitimate form of recreation that's more than just a little curiosity that you can finish in a few minutes. And in particular with the recent phenomenon of people streaming games on Twitch and with the competitive gaming, they'll always they're here in the popular culture. They're here to stay, and they have more exposure, I think, than ever before. You can go on Twitch and find someone playing some brand new game, or you can find them playing like some game from like 1984, and it's available for you to watch. I mean, there's so many. I like the breadth of scope. I think in games and types of games are very interesting, and there's so many out there you'll never play them all.